There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. Well, do I look a lot more kempt than on my video last night? I've just emerged from the shower after a haircut and powdered my nose, and I'm ready to go here on a Friday morning. It's a lot later than I wanted to get started because I have a shelf full of books to talk about. And luckily I don't have much personal news. It's starting to warm up. The snow is gone. I think it's all gone, and it'll be another week or two, I think, if it holds, if the weather holds, that I'll be able to start filming outside again. I'm wearing my some of these, this is your favorite of my new blouses last year, and I put it on to encourage spring to keep on nudging its way closer. I don't have any Patreon updates, and I don't have any personal news. Things are going well. I've had a great week personally, reading-wise, every which way-wise. And here's the week in review. Here I am with a TBR for a brand new readathon happening in the month of May. It's called Mental Health May Readathon, and it is put on by two of the most indispensable booktubers out there. Kim of Middle of the Book March, and Marilyn Maya Mendoza of Marilyn Maya Mendoza. So, I'm so glad that they have brought this readathon to BookTube, and I'm going to link both of their announcement videos where they share very powerful personal stories about the topic and tell us more about what this readathon's all about. This is the unkempt version of Sean the Book Maniac to tell you about a new to me literary prize. It's the 26th annual, so where the hell have I been? I think it's a rather obscure prize. Here is a novel by Vita Sackville West, The Edwardians, 1930, I believe. I have only read by her, I think, the one about the old lady. What was it called? All Passion Spent. For a minute, I did not know why my heart was beating faster than usual. Then I remembered the old reason. He had not come home. Oh, I just love this so much. All right, so as I said, holy smokes, we have to talk. I have one bale to tell you about. I have finished, I have finished 5 books. That's the most number of books I finished in any week so far this year, I think, and I don't need to be proud of that, but it just, a lot of books that I was gradually reading over time, I finished, and I had some buddy reads where I had to keep up with the pace that are finished. So yeah, lots of books to talk about that I've finished, 4 books that I've started to tell you about, and then talk about the books I'm going to be starting in the coming week. So let's get going. My bale. I was quite sad about this, but I didn't end up getting along with this Scottish debut novel, Ginger and Me, by Elissa Soave, I think. I didn't like it. It's about a protagonist that several reviewers have compared to Eleanor Oliphant, which I got about 8 minutes into on the audio and put it aside. I just didn't like the writing and didn't get invested in the characters. There was a couple things I liked about the character, but I didn't think the character work was subtle enough, nuanced enough, and I could never comfortably resolve my doubts about the author's stance toward the character, because she is just clueless, naive protagonist. And she's had a hard life, not a lot of support, and she maybe has some spectrum issues, maybe she has some kind of mental health issue, but she's certainly just kind of a sad sack of a protagonist, and I never got, like I say, I never could be quite at comfortable with what, because everybody was laughing at her in the novel, or so many people were, and were we supposed to be laughing at her with those people or not? The character work just wasn't developed enough, and I didn't like the writing, so I bailed. This was a buddy read with one of my subscribers and patrons. I still don't know how to identify her, but she has a different handle on the Homo Librariensis, I think is her commenter name, so we'll go with that. She and I are going to find something else to buddy read, maybe a short story collection. She was getting along with it better than I was, so I think she's going to continue. This has quite a high 4.08, I think, rating on Goodreads, so it obviously has worked for a lot of people. Didn't work for me. I got about 130 pages into it, maybe. Okay, so now let's move on to what I have finished. The first one I finished this week is this gay Canadian novel, The Geography of Pluto by Christopher DiRaddo. His debut came out a few years ago. Originally published 2014, and this edition I think is more recent than that. And I loved it. It was a 5-star read. It was a 5-star debut novel, so I probably wouldn't have given it 5 stars if it hadn't been a debut. I don't always take that into account, but here I did. The shortcomings or the things that I didn't love so much were so minimal. I just loved the way the characters were. I loved the heart and the emotional truth of this novel, the characters. It's about a middle-class, white, gay geography teacher, high school teacher, and his relationship with his mom. She's not comfortable with him as a gay man, but they're all each other has. The father died when the protagonist was 2 years old or something. His best friend, who's a lesbian, and then his his dating and sex life. And it just rang really true for me on all of those relationships and all of that. The portrayal of gay life, and I think it was actually set. I think it might have been set in the 90s or something. I not right at the present day anyway. I just related to so much. In a way, it reminded me of Just by Looking at Him by Ryan O'Connell that I read earlier this year. That one was a lot funnier, but very similar issues portrayed here in a more serious way. And I loved that Ryan O'Connell novel as well. This one was just so emotionally satisfying. And I'm going to do a full review because this is a review copy from the publisher. And I'm looking forward to, so stay tuned for that. And I'm looking forward to probably trying his second novel, it's coming soon and during Pride Month. But the last thing I'll say about it here is that the writing is so simple. Like there were no Sunday sentences in this book. I don't mean it, and it wasn't bad writing, but it was just very plain style, and boy did it work for this story. What a great debut novel, and very moving. There's scenes in here at the end where I just got all verklempt, so that's always a 5-star read for Sean the Book Maniac. The next one that I finished, I'm really happy that I stuck with it because I almost bailed twice on it. And it ended up being a 5-star read, and that is the collection of linked short stories. Thank You, Mr. Nixon by Gish Jen. I really disliked the first story, and it was it was a weak beginning to the collection, and then I encountered some really like $64 words where a $2 word would have done in the second story, and put it down for a couple days and thought better of it, and continued with that story and realized that kind of fit into the milieu of the characters in that particular story, so it was fine. And then I just started to get more and more invested, so that by the end of it, I was riveted. It is a really nuanced look at the intertwined lives of several Asian and Asian American characters, with some really profound commentary that does not come across as being kind of tagged on or overdone like it hit me in the first story. I've ordered a copy. I did this on audio only. I've ordered a paper copy because I loved it so much. And I will reread it and reread that first story someday to see how it hits me in the context of everything else. There were so many connections between the characters, and I was about 3 or 4 stories in before, because I don't pay attention to characters' names. I don't follow anybody by their name. I have no idea who these people are. But I started to realize that the characters were showing up in different stories. So I want to reread it to get all of that connection. But once I started paying attention to it, I began to appreciate what an achievement this collection was. That part of it was done so well and ended up making so many subtle social political statements. I loved the stance towards China politically because it's an evil regime, the evilest in the world, and it could portray that without getting on a soapbox like I tend to about these things. Because there's lots of things to criticize about America. It's apples and oranges between totalitarian regimes and democracies. I think we can all agree on that. But don't get me started on all everything to do with America. And just really fully realized characters. I'm not going to do a full review. I may consider doing a full review after I've read it from cover to cover a second time. But one of my favorites that was just brilliant was that an adjunct English prof discovered that one of his Chinese immigrant students had plagiarized her essay at the same time as he was engaging in trying to sell an art forgery and make enough money to live in America. And the moral ambiguity of that was really well explored in that story. So a big hit. I now look at Gish in a new light. I guess I'd heard some negative reviews of her years ago and never read the novel. I think it was called The Country Wife or something wife, and got rid of it without reading it. But now she is on my radar. This was a very, very satisfying short story cycle. And I did the whole thing on the treadmill downstairs. I also finished in record time. This was a 2-week buddy read with Joe Smith, Cobalt Blue by Sachin Kundalkar, translated from the Marathi by Jerry Pinto. Loved it. Now, I was raving about this last week, and it was about the brother's experience of the paying guest coming to stay upstairs and him having a love affair with him, only to have him leave in the middle of the night with his sister. And so the second half is from the sister's perspective, and I really missed the emotional dynamics of the brother and the paying guest. He's never named, so I'm just going to keep calling him the paying guest, but he's this really gorgeous, mysterious young man. And then the second half is told in diary entries from the perspective of the sister when 6 months later she comes back with her tail between her legs after the paying guest abandoned her wherever they were, Pondicherry, I think. And she's an emotional wreck and in fact receiving mental health treatment. And it's her diary as she writes her way back into kind of healing and self-confidence. So I wasn't sure if I was going to like the second half at all, but I got fully invested in a completely different way in her. And the siblings were like two ships passing in the night. They were completely obtuse of what was going on. They were both having emotional entanglements with this paying guest. And emotionally, in terms of any kind of emotional stability, he was a ne'er-do-well and just a brief candle. What am I trying to say? He didn't stick around, but he brought something out of both of them that led them onto their own self-actualized paths. It was a beautiful book. The author he's more well known. I think this is his only novel. There might be one other novel that hasn't yet been translated, but he's mostly known as a filmmaker. And this has been made into a movie, which of course the author, who's a famous film director in India, directed and wrote. It's in Hindi language. It's on Netflix right now. I'm going to watch it, maybe even tonight, certainly as soon as possible. I think Joe and I might buddy watch it. So many of these books were 5-star reads for me this week. And that's the whole bailing thing, right? If it's going to be anything less than a 4-star read, why would I finish it? So I get a lot of 5-star reads with that philosophy. But this one is probably the one closest to my heart. It's the biography of the Queen Mum. Let's Have Another Drink. The Dry Wit and Fizzy Life of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother by Gareth Russell. Just maybe one of my favorite royal biographies, and I've read a lot of royal biographies that I have loved. But this is a new writer to me, and he's written stuff other popular history other than royal biographies. I want to read absolutely everything he's written. He's a Northern Irish writer, I think is where he hails from. He certainly lives in Belfast now. This was phenomenal. It was not as fizzy and witty. It wasn't exclusively fizzy and witty, because her life wasn't. Certainly the first half of her life. But, once she could kind of put her feet up after the war and scaring Hitler, the second half of her life, she was a grandmother and royalty, and she had a lot of cocktails. And I just fell in love with her all over again. Learned so much about her, and I'll keep my comments to that. Might consider doing a full review for those of you for the 2 people out there that are interested in hearing more about it, but I recommend it so highly. It's entertaining, it's informative, hundreds and hundreds of fabulous little anecdotes about the Queen Mum that are in this book, as well as a whole bunch of serious stuff about her life. Loved it! And finally, the last one that I finished is this biography, Ivan the Terrible, by Henri Troyat. I believe it's Troyat. I gave this one 4 stars just because it was quite well written, I thought. But I'm not sure if it's a failure of the author or just that Ivan the Terrible was so terrible and committed so many atrocities, and they were described in such vivid detail, the way he tortured people and how much enjoyment, almost sexual enjoyment, he got out of watching and participating in that torture and killing, that it got campy for me. Like, it was comedic, like just ridiculous, the repetitiveness. And there was just so much gore in this book that it just started to, my eyes started to glaze over, and not that I was, in places I was actually bored by it, but I couldn't, it was so horrific that there was no way to take it in, so unconsciously, subconsciously, I just started to become a campy kind of comic thing. And I guess I can kind of laugh about it because it was so many centuries ago, but he really was a genocidal maniac. He does do a good job, I think, of portraying the psychological makeup of this terrible guy, because he did constantly feel guilty. He was devoutly religious and second-guessing himself. He tried to marry Queen Elizabeth I, and then tried to marry one of her nieces, and they weren't really having any of that. He murdered his son. I must have known that and forgot. He was a bad dude. If you're interested in him, I don't know of any, I don't think anybody else has written a biography of him since this one, which has been out for decades, and it's really a good introduction. Certainly sheds light on Russia today and the Russian character, how much they are dependent on having an autocrat. This book screams Putin and Stalin, and there's something in the Russian culture where they seem to need that kind of an ogre for a leader. It was informative on that level as well. Glad I read it. Glad to be finished with it, because I just got really sick and tired of hearing about all his atrocities. All right, those are the books that I've finished. I have 4 started that I haven't finished. I had hoped to finish this last night, but I just couldn't. It's a really heavy read, and not a book that can be rushed, and that is this novella from Zimbabwe, The Stone Virgins by Yvonne Vera, and this was for a group read that Bernie Lombardi is hosting. It's finishing today, a 7-day group read. I couldn't keep up with it, so I've got about 50 pages left to read. This is really powerful and one of the most beautifully written works of African literature I've ever read. The prose is to die for. I think it might not be to everyone's taste, although certainly everybody in this large group of people reading it up and sharing about it on Bernie's group were as mesmerized, if not more so, by the prose as I am. And it's a really tough story to read because it's about the Civil War. I don't even know if you can call it a civil war. Rhodesia became Zimbabwe and became independent in 1980, and then a few short years later, that genocidal maniac, Mugabe, put down a rebellion in Matabeleland, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and that basically turned into a civil war where between 4,000 and 80,000 people were massacred, and this novel is about that conflict set in Matabeleland. And it centers on the experiences of 2 sisters and a couple men so far. I would say it's written poetically. It's very dark. It's extremely violent. I have to say, the violence is written so beautifully, which doesn't make it any easier to read. It's so richly centered on the natural beauty of this part of Zimbabwe, that like certain trees and flowers end up becoming characters in the novel. And I'm not saying that with as much nuance as it's portrayed on the page, but it makes it a very unusual novel. I'm pretty sure I'm going to say when I'm finished that I loved it, but it's not a book that you should pick up without knowing how tough of a read it is. However beautifully told. It's incredible. I have nothing but good to say about the books I've started, so I also thought I might finish this Torrey Peters novella, Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones. And every time I held this book up over the years, I always say, I don't like the title, I don't like the cover image, and within 3 pages into it, all of that makes sense. And it's a great story. It's kind of speculative, 71 pages, about two trans women in a kind of dystopian near future. And it has to do with, and boy, it's an important book to read right now because, good Lord, just the news yesterday about a trans member of Congress in, where was it, Montana? North Dakota was ejected from the House, and then some ban in the other, either Montana or North Dakota, I forget which was which, but just yesterday about banning them from being able to officially identify with the gender that they are. It's just horrible stuff. It's scary, the backlash against trans issues. It is really freaking scary. And this book does not read very speculatively because I think as things just progress a little bit more scarily, as the backdrop for this novel, the trans women there's something to do with black market estrogen that these two trans women are getting that are harvested from pigs. So that's the premise of it. The characters are as vivid to me as the characters were in Detransition Baby, so it's wonderfully written and I'm completely immersed in it. And this is the biggest surprise of my reading week. I'm on page 14, but I'm already ready to call it. This book that I have been putting off for more than a year because the premise of it was such a turnoff is amazing. Darryl by Jackie Ess. And it's amazing because by page 2, I was fully invested in Darryl. And it's way too simplistic to say he has a cuckolding fantasy. By page 14, I think that it's a much more complicated story than that. But he certainly, as the story opens, is in that kind of a three-way with his wife and some hot butch man. And the story's going to go from there. But his character is so deeply, effortlessly, I don't know how Jackie Ess does it, portrayed on the page where I just was invested by page 2. A really fascinating character, Darryl. And I believe that Darryl's story is going to be the one that becomes a trans story. I don't know that for sure, but I am gobsmacked at how quickly I fell into this, and all my worries about it being a book about cuckolding, it's not glorified. And it's really a minimal part of how Darryl's character, I think I can call Darryl he at this point in the story, is represented on the page. It's rich. Scott and Nell, hello, you were right. Scott, you were right for a change. Can't wait to keep going with this. And finally, I have started my reread of Crampton Hodnet by Barbara Pym, one of her posthumous novels that she actually wrote during World War II, I believe. And I am reading this to my top tier patron Melanie as part of her Bibliophile Bestie benefits, and oh, what a delight. It's a reread for both of us. I believe Melanie has read it more than once already, and we're having such a good time reading it. Oh, I have a full review of this. I'll link it below. I'm not going to say anything more, but it's as delightful this far into a reread, if not more so, than it was the first time around. Alright, so those are what I've started. What a fabulous reading week. I think next week's going to be just as fabulous. Fingers crossed. Well, this was a great opportunity to bring my number of current reads down. I've finished 5 books, but I'm committed to, and quite happy to, but committed to starting 5 new books. So the number's not coming down, but who cares? I'm having such a good time. I'm starting my advanced reading copy of the forthcoming new novel by Sharon Butala, the Prairie writer. She now lives in Calgary, but lived for decades in Saskatchewan. It's called Leaving Wisdom, and it's coming out at the end of May. So I am going to start it now in time so that I can finish it in time to have a Zoom chat interview with Sharon Butala, which I'm really excited about, in the middle of the month, and have it ready to put up just before the book comes out. Can't wait for that. I love the cover image. I think it's fabulous. It's about a retired social worker, and I have to have an audiobook to listen to this week on the treadmill, and so I actually started one when I was considering bailing on the Gish Jen short story collection, and I'm glad I didn't bail on it, but this one is coming up next, and I thought that I couldn't get an affordable ebook, so I bought the book. It's here. I'm going to do it kind of as a bit of an audio text combo. It is a debut novella from an Indo-British writer, Chetna Maroo, Western Lane. I just talked about this on a book haul video on my Patreon. If you didn't know, all my book hauls are on Patreon from now on. And read the first paragraph there, and it sucked me in more than it did when I listened to it on audio. The 11-year-old protagonist, her mother has died, and her father has got her training really hard to play squash. And plot ensues. The writing is beautiful. It's a short one. I may have finished it by this time next week, and I'll be starting that the next time I go down to the treadmill. It's hard for me to get down to the gym on Fridays because I spend the whole day doing my Friday reads, and then I'm too tired to do anything, and I have a book launch to go to tonight, but tomorrow. And as you may have seen on my TBR for Mental Health May, this is a book that I'm doing double duty with, Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason, which fits into Mental Health May, and also Misery May. And this was a book that Nell and Scott too, I think, yeah, both Nell and Scott loved. And it's supposed to be sorrowful and blissful. I'm the last remaining booktuber who hasn't read it, so I'm not going to go on and on about it here, but looking forward to getting started. And I just kind of glossed over the fact of Misery May, this other fabulous new readathon debuting this year, put on by Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot and Gemma of Gem of Books. Those announcement videos are also linked in the show notes. And this novel was also doing double duty. This is Dandelion by Jamie Chai Yun Liew. And this will be for the Asian Readathon and the Mental Health May, because it's a family from Brunei living in British Columbia, and mental illness, I believe, is a big part of the story. This one is not so famous. Lindy gave me her copy. She's really good that way. And this came out in 2022, and she liked it. She's just not the kind of person that hangs on to her books. What a good bookish friend to have. I'm only ever willing to part with my bales. And finally, this is another one that I'm really excited to start. This is a buddy read with Joe Smith, a Swedish novel in English translation, Collected Works by Lydia Sandgren, translated from the Swedish by Agnes Groom. Collected Works, a novel. I love the title. The title is what hooked me, and I had a fabulous bite-sized book chat with Ashwin in India about this. So I'm going to put a link to that, and he totally sold me on it, and Joe and I are going to read it. It's about just under 600 pages. We're going to do it over 6 weeks. The premise of it is that the mother and wife has disappeared several years ago, and her husband and adult children, they just kind of get on with their lives, so there's not a lot about the disappearance. So the disappearance is not the focus of the book, but it's always there in the background. I'm not describing it nearly as well as Ashwin did when he sold it to me so deeply, so go watch his bite-sized chat. Lydia Sandgren is otherwise a psychologist. Yeah, it is a debut. I'm a little nervous reading a book by a psychologist or a therapist. What I meant to say, what I should have said, is I'm a little bit nervous reading a work of fiction by a psychologist or therapist. I haven't ever had a good experience with that, or I maybe just have an innate prejudice that those that are psychologists should psychologize and those that can write should write, but maybe I'm wrong. But apparently this is supposed to be wonderful. So, another great reading week, folks, and next week's looks like it could shape up to be so as well, and I hope also for you. Thanks for watching.